What's up, you draft nerds out there? My name is Draft Raw, and thank you for tuning in to In the Clutch. What's up, Ravens fans? I'm your host, Draft Raw. This is In the Clutch. And in this episode, let's talk Ravens. Now, as we go through this episode, we're going to talk about Ravens and the possibility in free agency, the draft, and a scenario that involves Orlando Brown Jr. with some tradable picks within this year's draft. So without further ado, let's just get straight into it. Let's talk about the free agency for the Ravens. Now, while I'm making this video, it is before free agency. So if it comes out after free agency, just know that this video was made before free agency actually happens. So we'll see if I name a scenario or a possibility that may happen within free agency if it actually becomes true. Now, with the talk around Baltimore and Ravens fans is that everyone wants a number one receiver. Now, we've already seen Allen Robinson and Chris Godwin get the franchise tag, so they're kind of off the board. With Allen Robinson, maybe not so much because there's a situation where he's been tagged, but he could still get traded. That was a scenario that a lot of people in the network and the media has brought up. But if that's not the case, and he does stay with the Bears or whatever, maybe the Ravens don't even go after that way anyway. And they already said they won't go and try to get a number one receiver. I like wide receiver Kenny Golladay anyway. I love this guy so much because he was a guy that I studied in the draft back in 2017. He has all the tools that you want in the number one receiver. He's big, he's tall, he can make big catches, he's got the speed, he's got everything that you want. The problem is it's going to be the price tag. The price tag for him is going to be upward north of $18 million. And that's something that we probably can't afford or probably won't try to afford. And with the talk of them already saying we won't go after the big number one guys, there are at least, I would say, 3 guys that I can name in this scenario where they can go after in terms of wide receivers. The first guy that we're going to talk about is Corey Davis. Now, Corey Davis is actually my least choice of the guys. The biggest reason why he's my least choice is have a lot to do with when the Tennessee Titans played the Green Bay Packers, Corey Davis was completely shut down by Jaire Alexander. Now, I love Jaire Alexander. I think that he's one of the top 5 corners within the NFL. The problem is that when you're locked down, like the simple fact is that he didn't make not one play while Jaire was covering him, actually didn't even make a play in the game, makes me look at it and say, why would I want this guy? Yeah, he's a solid route runner. Yeah, he's got good hands, even yards after catch. Like, he's got ability to being a great receiver. And actually, he was my favorite receiver coming out in the 2017 draft. The problem is that it hasn't turned into anything in the NFL. There was so much potential, but it never really turned into it just didn't turn into nothing. And he ended up underwhelming. And he's not really a bust, but he's not the player that I at least thought for him to be. It's a scenario that fans have been talking about, but I'm not going to be on board with it. If it happens, sure. Okay, we got another receiver on board. He's in here. He can work with Lamar and everything. But if you're expecting number one receiver traits and number one receiver ability from a guy like him, you're going to be sadly disappointed. Another guy that I would actually really, really love for the Ravens to actually grab in free agency is Marvin Jones from Detroit, the other wide receiver from Detroit. You have Kenny Golladay, whose price is probably too high, but Marvin Jones is going to be just right. He's a guy that he's been a big play threat everywhere he's been, whether he was in Cincinnati or in Detroit with the Lions. He's been a guy that's been consistent, catching balls, making big plays. He's a guy that, to me, has number one wide receiver traits. He was just never in an offense where he was always the featured guy because you always had another guy, whether it was Golden Tate or, like I said, Kenny Golladay, who becomes the big receiver for their team, the big time number one receiver. But he's a guy that's been consistent, and he's a guy that I think that can make a difference for the Ravens team, especially when you have Hollywood Brown on one side and definitely with Duvernay in the slot. And the last guy we're going to talk about is A.J. Green. A.J. Green just brings a veteran presence for the Ravens. I think that a lot of people sour on him because he didn't play that well this year, and he was kind of hurt. And then last year he was hurt, and this year he didn't play that well. But I think he was just tired of the Cincinnati Bengals organization, and he just didn't want to be part of that anymore. And he decided to really not play as hard, knowing that he's probably going to go into the open market and probably get good, solid, decent money. He knew he's a guy that was getting older, so eventually he wasn't going to get the big contracts anymore. But a person that I think the Ravens could really benefit, especially the young wide receivers that we have on the team, like Miles Boykin and Duvernay and James Prochet and Hollywood Brown. This is a guy that it's a Ravens type of move to grab a guy like A.J. Green, but I think that it could work out in the long run. Now, with those three guys out the way, we can go into maybe some offensive linemen that could be available within free agency. We can even possibly go into some edge rushers that will be available. I would just say this. I think that the Ravens should keep their, I guess you could say their smaller edge rushers in terms of the guys like Yannick and Judon. They're probably going to walk. But looking at Purnell, who we already re-signed, looking at Jahai Ward, who I wish we re-signed, and looking at a guy like Tyler Bowser, I will bring those other two guys back to the team instead of going out and try to get a big-time edge guy. I think those two guys are good enough to be solid backups for a scenario that I have for us going into the draft. With that also being said, when it comes to the offensive linemen, I don't think the Ravens may not be big spenders in terms of like going big for the offensive line. But if we do the scenario that I'm going to talk about, Orlando Brown Jr., I think that one player that we could bring in who's not an interior offensive lineman, but a tackle, Ricky Wagner, who actually used to play for the Baltimore Ravens from 2013 to about 2016. He used to play for us as a right tackle, so he will come in and be able to replace Orlando Brown Jr. for that literally the exact same position that Orlando actually plays, in position that he's already played in Baltimore. A guy that I think I put a lot of trust in because he at one point was one of the better right tackles within the NFL. And I think that he would make sense for the Ravens to bring in to be a solid stalwart on the edge next to, on the other side of Ronnie Stanley. Now, that's free agency. Let's get to, I don't want to get to the draft yet. Let's get to the trade. Orlando Brown Jr. wants to be traded. He wants to be a left tackle. I have a scenario that I think would actually make sense. And I did my studying a little bit when it came to, I looked at an NFL draft chart value, which kind of gives you where teams may, the number of points that teams give certain draft picks. The number one overall pick being the highest points, and obviously the last pick being the lowest. But it's a draft chart that kind of gives you a sense of how an NFL team may think. So here's my trade scenario. You trade Orlando Brown Jr. to the Minnesota Vikings, plus your first round pick, the 27th overall pick. In return, you get their first round pick, which is going to be the 14th pick. So you're going up 13 spots to get the 14th pick overall. Plus, because they don't have a second rounder, we're going to get their third rounder, plus a fourth rounder, plus a fifth rounder. Now you think, well, dang, we're taking so many of their picks, but they're getting a great player in return. And if it's not, let's say, a third, fourth, and fifth with that first, it's not a third, let's just say at least a third and a fifth. One, we can get the third round pick that we gave them from Yannick Ngakoue. But two, we can look at trying to look at another pick from next year when it comes to them. Maybe we get their first this year, right? Their third this year, their fifth this year, maybe a second of next year. Maybe not a fourth. And a second is actually better than a fourth round pick will be this year. But the draft value is going to be really, really high because of where the pick is, and that's in the second round. But just looking at that, I think that's going to be a great scenario. Let's say it's not the next year pick. Let's say it's the first, third, and fifth round pick. First, third, fourth, and fifth round pick. To go up 13 spots will be amazing for the Ravens, especially if they let go of a player that they've already replaced. Let's say they actually signed Ricky Wagner. So they get rid of a player that doesn't want to be there. They go up those 14 spots, and now they got a top 15 pick. You got a third round pick that you got back from what we already traded them from Yannick Ngakoue. You got a fourth round pick and you got a fifth round. They also are able to trade all of those picks because they do have multiple third, fourth, and fifth round picks. If I'm not mistaken, they have 2 thirds, they have 3 fourths, and they have 2 fifths. So it's a scenario and a situation where they have the extra picks where they can do it. And I think that they should think about actually making that trade. Now, like I said, with doing that, you say, well, what happens in the draft now? You now have a first round pick in the top 14. You have your second round pick. You now have 2 thirds. You now have 2 fourths, and you have 2 fifths. So, what is the scenario? Who do we draft? Well, obviously, it's harder to predict who's to draft in the second, third, or fourth round pick. So, who to draft with that number 1 pick at 14th overall? I think they go edge rusher. They don't address edge rusher big in free agency. Maybe they address the receiver. Maybe they grab a Marvin Jones. Maybe they address the offensive line and grabbing a Ricky Wagner. And later on in the draft, they address the interior of the offensive line. But with that very first pick, I like Jaelan Phillips from Miami. To me, Jaelan Phillips, I talked about him in a previous video. He is the best edge rusher in this draft class. And he brings a lot of athleticism, a lot of freakness, just a lot of tools that you will want from an edge rusher in terms of rushing a passer and stopping the run. Simply the best, and this is a guy that I think will definitely be there at 14 and could be a very, very, very good player for the Baltimore Ravens. Well, anyway, that was what I wanted to talk about in the Ravens talk. I thank anybody for watching. Once again, my name is Draft Raw, and I'll see you later. Thank you once again for tuning in to In the Clutch. Once again, my name is Draft Raw, and if you want to see more videos from me, then you can subscribe to my YouTube channel at Draft Raw. And if you want to hear more from me, then you can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at the same name, Draft Raw. Once again, thank you. I'll see you next time.